Hi, my name is Kyriakou, and fortunately my partner had to be in Athens to attend some urgent project meetings. So I'll present by myself. The project we're presenting, Micropolitan America, started as a proposal for a traveling fellowship at Columbia University at GSAP a few years ago, where we wanted to explore America through the places that nobody wants to visit. Since there were no particular criteria about identity for our trip destinations, we decided to visit cities whose names end with a suffix "ville". Architects are always fascinated with exotic, and our version of exotic is the America behind New York. Young, instant, and radically small, the American town operates as an extreme condition of minimal complexity and minimum urbanity. If America is the original version of modernity, according to Baudrillard, then the extremities of the vast internal American territory, understood here as a sequence of Greenvilles, Crossvilles, Maryvilles, spread out in Tennessee, Texas, or Louisiana, offer us an insight to an accelerated end state of that modernity. Micropolitan America produces an alternative understanding of urbanism that studies the American town as an instant and autonomous urban setup, one that is simple enough to be broken down in primary and identifiable elements, tools that enable urban function to operate at its minimum. The towns are seen through a lens of radical remoteness as sprawled, diluted, and scattered nodes of a network that strives to conquer a vast territory. This project produces a contemporary reading of the internal fringes of the United States by carving a cross-country section through the rural micropolitan American territory. The 2016 election revealed another aspect of the territory of interest, radically positioned on only one color of the post-election map. We see ourselves within the lineage of traveling researchers producing on-the-road architecture discourse, from Verturi and Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas to Atelier Bow Wow's Made in Tokyo or Van Eyck's Trip to the Villages. We set out to traverse the American landscape from north to south and from east to west, stopping at and investigating scattered dots of built environment, developing a research methodology applied on the map and on the road. Through a series of road trips mapped out and executed weaving through remote states, we follow a sequence of stops in places that no one's going to travel to. Places that are not famous for anything, invisible from a certain altitude on a digital or physical map, places that we identify as villes. Ville is a town that is smaller than a city, even though the terms town and city are legally interchangeable in the US, bearing the suffix ville and incorporated to have a town hall, an identifiable main street, and some sort of urban condition that doesn't always manifest itself in a similar manner, yet it always exists. In the suffix ville hides a distorted application of an urban condition that selects from the structure of the city elements that in themselves theoretically cannot exist autonomously. The suffix ville provided us with a selection system that is both arbitrary and organized. We then decided to add to that list towns that are named after other cities, the Florences, Parises, Romes, etc., and realized that the selection convention was based on a simple premise. These names reflect the fledgling town's ambition of immediately becoming a city, either by calling themselves as one, or by mimicking and thus borrowing the significance of another. It is a sort of reverse colonization where a town is not named New Something, but Something or Something City. In the words of George Stewart, to reject the Ville is to deny something very deeply rooted in the American past. We see a connection between the application of the foreign suffix Ville to what otherwise is a mere municipal corporation and the adoption of a recognizable city name, in most cases European city, as yet another attempt to simulate urbanity within the remoteness of the American territory. Towns of such scale and type reflect the simplicity and straightforwardness that allows them to be interpreted as the absolute minimum urban cell. A ville has at least one church, one post office, a town hall, a bar. One building of its main public function. Urban space appears depleted in its absolute minimum, sprinkled around the gazebo, the courthouse, and the prison in a form of extensive flower beds, green lawns, and quaint structures, yet always there. The trip to the villes is a scan, in other words, of a territory that is rendered continuous through the trajectory of the observer, becomes a way to flatten the research object to an elemental version of itself. The trip to the villes is an attempt to revisit the origins of the city as a recent archaeology of the notion of the settlement through its youngest and less complex manifestation. The project sets out to collect and eventually bring back fringes on multiple scales. Initially, each town is coined on a territorial scale, usually found on an intersection of the Jeffersonian grid, wedged in a pinch of the landscape, placed unapologetically on their specific location by forces of the industry, or as intermediate nodes on a larger infrastructural network. A ville can be a company town, a water stop, or an oil field guardian. Zooming in, the town reveals its own generic or idiosyncratic geometric structure, consistently appearing to be waiting to get filled, to be completed, empty more than emptied. Stepping out of the car and getting closer to the dusty body of the town, the effortless identification of the main street or main square points to the more significant built components of the settlement. The courthouse, the city hall, the church, corner store, gazebo, school, post office, water tower, and entry sign reveal anonymous yet radical acts of design. To quote from Colin Rose and John Hedgeck's Lockhart, Llano, Lampasas, Gainesville, Belton, Georgetown, Lockhart's, and others are all as much the same as so many French medieval bus sites. They have all of them something of the unqualified decisiveness, the diagrammatic coherence of architectural models, and scorpiously regular they appear almost more than real towns, to be small cities in primitive paintings. Something of their interest derives from their conformity, but within the accepted pattern, innumerable variations are to be found. An alternative history of the city is attempted in media res. These relatively young but still centennial urban aggregations are utilized to tell the story of the city from the middle, going both forwards and backwards. The American town becomes the unit of urbanity that cannot be further subdivided, minimized, or simplified. It is conceived as the absolute minimum to be potentially added upon, improved, or extended. In its radical smallness, and size here does not refer uniquely to square mileage, the ville presents a version of the city that has purged or actually never acquired further complexities. By examining the ville, we examine the most basic manifestation of a contemporary urban settlement, this inherently American condition that is neither suburb or countryside. The project in this exhibition is organized in 4 chapters, each one tackling a different aspect of the ongoing project's output, as it was explored through a series of urban, through a series of design studios and seminars at the College of Architecture at Texas Tech University during fall 2018. The chapter Ville is the repository of the photographic documentation from the road trips performed by X Studio in different times and territories. Process catalogs the invisible exploration students go through in order to produce extremely detailed 3-dimensional drawings of the selected structures of interest. Survey is an archive of town and building portraits produced in the framework of a representation seminar working off the Ville project premise. And finally, projection is a registry of design speculation synthesized through the Ville Research Studio at Texas Tech, where students were invited to produce architectural narratives that interrupted, challenged, or redefined existing conditions identified in West Texan towns. Our overall approach and methodology shares common ground with the field of microhistory. The historical investigation of a well-defined, smaller unit of research, most often a single event, aspiring to ask large questions in small places. Through the production of local histories, in microhistory, the point of view of the researcher also becomes part of the account. Learning from Las Vegas being the most recognizable of those projects responsible for the creation of the learning from genealogy. To add to that, more generally, the work of an academic research studio, the obsession with a specific place, typology, or location also perform under a certain light as cases of microhistory. Between the micro-urbanism of the Texan town and the hyper-context of the state, we deal with urbanism and architecture in a radically small and vast scale, respectively. Students were asked to perform in a deep reading of the selected territory, aspiring to generate an understanding of the region through the elemental notion of town, inscribed within a network landscape of power. The networks at play can be physical or notional and can be summarized to the basic requirements to organize and sustain an urban community. Water and nutrition, energy, education, transportation of people and goods, administration, organized religion, leisure. Having selected an analytical lens to examine the territory, the students traveled long spans visiting towns on predefined cross-sections of the research regions. The area around Lubbock, Texas, provided a great example of extremities between the desert countryside and the towns. Returning from the road trip, the students translated their observations into design interrogations, acting on the latent potential of the town constellation. The objective is to loop the design arguments through a local intervention scale that exemplifies and challenges the current conditions as identified during the research. The aim is to be critical and not attempt to solve problems, rather hack the laid out system and subvert it. During the final phase of the studio, the students are asked to select the design medium through which they are going to deliver their thesis. The intellectual arguments produced by each project are expected to invent a format specific to each case and challenge conventions of architectural representation. The studio emphasizes the importance of dealing with the context and a design intervention on equal terms in an attempt to elevate the existing architecture to an unprecedented level of detail and focus. Following our fusion projects from last semester, presented through an exaggeration of typology or networks and aspiring to restore the ambition in small towns. Cemetery. The team explored the dynamic between landscape and urban form, visiting a number of towns in the West Texas High Plains and the Sierras of northern New Mexico and South Colorado. Eagle Nest, New Mexico is a leisure town organized in clusters around the arch of an artificial lake road. The project samples pieces of the surrounding landscapes, transports them, scales them, and arranges them on a 9-square grid in order to produce a system of social burial spaces intended to become a destination. The last landscape. Oil. Oil towns of West Texas become a case study for an imaginary scenario of uncontrolled profit. The intricacies of land ownership and mineral rights are unpacked into a speculative narrative where a town owns all the oil mined within its city limits. The project meditates the conditions of living and working in an oil field and proposes a veil of leisure above the productive ground condition, isolating from view and capitalizing on its profits. The leisure mountain becomes a canvas for social activities and a destination for tourists above a concealed hyper-efficient oil extraction field. Church. A town with 25 churches and 7 different denominations. One high school complex placed on the fringes of the town. The project hypothesizes on the inversion of the school with a newly synthesized downtown campus formulated out of the relocated church buildings. Secular and religious programs create a continuous occupation of the new Main Street and Courthouse Square throughout the day and the week. The team designs for an urban version of a small town high school whose extreme cross-programming exposes the life of the school to the life of the town, making both radically and new. The football goalposts are also the main traffic lights. The bell tower serves as a diving board, and classes take place where mass will happen on Sunday. Train. The abandoned pedestrian train network of West Texas, as well as the underutilized freight train cross-country rails, are used as the infrastructure of a university on track to exist. The team imagines a campus as vast as the West Texas territory and designs for 4 different university departments to organize themselves in motion using the existing railway network. Abandoned train stations and storage buildings become the temporary infrastructure that completes the schools once they stop in the different towns during the semester. Architecture, engineering, agriculture, and performing arts roam the territory and meet in pairs, or all 4 together in the extended campus the different train towns provide for them. I'm just going to skip a few because we're running out of time, I think. Okay. Healthcare. Settled in 1907 as a model town experiment by C.W. Post, the founder of the Post Cereal Company, Post Texas started as a utopian community and became one of the most active towns in West Texas, well connected through the rail and always at the edge of experimentation and technology. Driven by the town's active history and idiosyncratic present, the team proposed the incorporation of Post's unused Main Street buildings to an experimental wellness clinic, one that would strive to treat contemporary diseases such as allergies, autoimmunes, intolerances, and mental conditions. Buildings fronting the 8 main blocks are converted to clinics, treatment rooms, and recreation centers, maintaining the original fronts and inserting new functions behind them. The different programs meet along the main street, which is split in 2 by a linear lap pool, a symbol of catharsis and optimism to the future. In the project described, the idea of the ville as an organism that controls its fate and challenges its territory, simulating the ambition of the original settlements, comes to contrast with the current state of depletion and abandonment observed in most towns. We argue for the latent potential of every American town to become a ville and the pleasure of learning through what we see but we don't observe. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyriakos, for this presentation. Would anyone have a question? I have a question. Oh, there's a question over there? I'll let you go first.
It's not so much a question as an observation, but I think two things I really enjoyed. One is that you're presenting research on places that are not, well known to us, and I think it's really great that as a university, as a program, that you kind of look in the landscape around you for opportunities for projects. It really reminds me of what Chris Taylor's doing at Texas Tech, which I think is great. And also, again, this is not a question so much as an observation, but I think it's great that you're also trying to link the research to speculation on design, which I think I'd like to know a bit more about how that occurs, but I think it's great that half of the presentation is grounded in speculation. I would just want to know just how that occurs. I just feel like there's a kind of split in the presentation between the first part and the second part.
Well, you're right, and I mean, Chris has been an amazing influence in these last few months that we're in Texas, and we actually had the opportunity to spend some time with him on the road. You're right that it's basically the presentation has two phases. One is deriving from our personal research, a project that has been going on for a few years, and is the fascination with the American town as a kind of romantic idea of the past, but also a very kind of latent condition that is constantly overlooked, but as we saw in the recent elections, it can make very powerful statements. Now, to put this into a design curriculum, it's in our mind a very different process, and it goes beyond the kind of the objectives of the research. To a kind of more pedagogic agendas, and our position as architects with a constant kind of attitude towards questioning, speculating, and subverting. Our name, Xe in Greek, it stands for an, like as in undoing, or anti. So in that sense, we like to perform as constantly opposing and reacting to things that are given to us. And this American town is a very fixed situation we're trying to shake up in our projects.
I was wondering again about the split in the presentation, but I'm trying to figure out if there is a split because the photos you showed in the first half, which are very composed, there's a mise en scène quite obvious where you carefully select how you're going to show these things, show these towns, these villes as kind of phantomatic. They're not abandoned, right? There are people that live there. Mm-hmm. But yet you show them. We've had this comment on other presentations today and yesterday about why are there no people? And in your photos, it's quite obvious that you do not wish to have people, that it's like a phantom-like representation of the object. But when we get to the drawings, the projects, which I think is fascinating is that they're still empty. Now there are 3 people around the pool, 1 swimming, but most of is the only one, I think, where there are people. But your drawings are like these vivid colors, almost almost kind of comic book like. And so I was curious about this aesthetic, probably obsession that you two have about these very composed images, and making what seems like a very gray and brown and kind of dull town into this pink and blue, like striking color images. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, to the first part of the question, we don't show people because we don't see people. Because people live in the town, and if you look at the kind of population, demographic records, you will see that the towns are being occupied, and you see there are high schools and churches and kind of all the manifestations, all the buildings that manifest public life, but the actual public space is not being used. What we described as the main street is in most cases empty space. And that happens for a few reasons. One is that the town operates in a very idiosyncratic, very local and specific time schedule. Things do not open at 8 a.m. and close in the evening. Things open occasionally within the day at certain time windows that overlap with the activities of the agriculture or the industry around them. So there are moments that nothing happens in the town because nobody's in the town. The other reason is that a lot of the commercial activity is now moving, not now, I mean it has been happening for a while, I think moving to kind of greater commercial centers like shopping malls, Walmarts, which renders all these local stores unusable. So you would actually see a lot of empty stores. So that's why actually when we see people, we kind of really run and try to find a position to photograph them without them seeing us, because they might shoot us. It's a very interesting, very weird condition. Speaking of the drawings, I mean, we have a kind of a natural tendency to avoid everything that's very realistic. There is an agenda behind that in the particular course, which is revealing potential, and we're not here to solve problems or kind of present an image of the future of the town the way it should be. On the contrary, our position is that we provide these illustrations as images that are open to the audience's interpretation, images that could generate a thought, a certain kind of idea of what the town could be without prescribing it really precisely. So, and even though our narratives are pretty set and rigorous, even though sometimes completely absurd, we try not to render them in very specific terms.
Thank you. Is there another question? Yes, Jean-Maxime.
Thank you. I think my question or my observation goes along the lines of Martin's and Carol's. This is a very fascinating, often quirky presentation, and dealing with the semiotics of Venturi and Scott Brown and the whole kind of like landscape of highways. I mean, this kind of Highway 66 kind of atmosphere. I'm just wondering if through the work you've been doing in photography and with the students, is there any sort of like loose footprint on the kind of ambiguities that are being built around these the making of city, and if you've been observant of certain mutant patterns within these typologies of these very rigid I guess, typologies of the church, of the oil tower, the water tower, if there is anything that's kind of, any kind of
Destabilizing
new sorts of
agent.
patterns appearing. I mean, this is something that we might see in, in any small town here in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada, the US. I mean, these sort of like reconfigurations of like, say, like dead shopping malls, into something else, or just like going beyond the sign of the building itself and trying to engage with the, it's very loose imaginary. I'm totally with you on all these.
No,
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question. And I'm not sure how to answer it,
Yeah.
but
You can ask a question.
well, what we've been seeing is kind of a reverse evolution. The town used to be, and that's not the case for every town, of course, because we're talking about the vast country, and I would rather speak about West Texas specifically to answer the question, rather than kind of try to generalize for every state we have visited. But basically what we observe is a kind of reverse evolution, where spaces that traditionally were public and collective, and it would allow for kind of a more unstable occupation. Let's say the church and the courthouse and the school used to share the same building, right? Whereas now what we see is the extreme opposite. There's extreme specificity and a kind of gentrification within these buildings as well. I mean, there's a town that has 25 churches, right? And out of 7 different denominations. That's a town of 5,000 people. It's not a large city. So it seems that people tend to kind of move away from each other, and that's something that we have observed also in kind of informal interviews when being there. So there's a tendency for that emptiness. It's not just physical; it's also kind of social.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.